Alrighty.
Okay.
Looks like it's working. So let's, I suppose we should start with introductions, shouldn't we? So I feel like I know you like so well, and we've never met before, but we've spoken a lot on email, haven't we, since Christmas, I would say.
Yeah.
So would you like to introduce yourself?
Blog, yeah, I've known you since I came across your blog, really, because I actually mentioned it in the book, and then I think I can't remember how we got in contact, but yeah, we both seem to be in agreement that Ian Bailey is innocent anyway.
Yeah, that's right. So you mentioned me in your book, but I didn't know about that. And I think you saw the blog, and I got the book soon after that, and I read it through and thought, yeah, we're agreeing on everything, basically. So would you like to introduce yourself? You're a professional, aren't you? I'm just an amateur.
I don't think you're an amateur. I mean, what you've done so far is journalism, you're obviously doing quite well at it. But yeah, I spent years as a journalist. I haven't been doing much journalism in recent years. I've been doing more ghostwriting, and then more later I kind of took a break from it all, and then I got an ordinary job, and then I'm now doing kind of creative writing and mentoring people. But yeah, for decades I was a journalist. And I covered the courts. I covered true crime. I also covered a lot of stories. I'm better known for kind of feature stories. But the Ian Bailey story, I covered that. Not from the very beginning, but I remember it from the very beginning. It was a big. And then I was living abroad then during a lot of the early court cases. But when I came back, the story was still rumbling on, and he was still being blamed. And as far as you could see, there was no evidence. And I think it was in 2011 when I actually covered it for a newspaper, when I was commissioned to cover it, and at that point he was in university, and I tried to get an interview with him. So that's when I met Jules, and that's when I really got interested in the story. And I've listened to all my colleagues, and all the other journalists I knew thought he was guilty. And I could never get my head around why they were so sure. And they were believing the locals, but the locals would say he was guilty. But I'd say why? But basically because if you boil it down, he was a weirdo and he wasn't very likable. Yeah. He was probably neurodivergent. We didn't know that much about that in those days. Yeah, I mean, like literally, it's only I think only in the past 5 years that people have been really talking about neurodivergence. And I think Ian Bailey was kind of he may have been a bit autistic, but he was masking it, as they say. People often do, a high functioning autistic person. So that would explain why he couldn't read the room when people were bored listening to his poetry, and he didn't know that. We all know people like that. I know, like I even wonder sometimes if I might be on the spectrum. I think maybe everyone is on some kind of spectrum. So
yes,
we're somewhere along the spectrum, and we all do things that no, I don't think there's anyone that is this mythical person who gets on with everyone. But Ian Bailey was sort of an outsider of outsiders. He didn't even have a tribe of people that understood him. He was cut off from his roots.
He really was.
Yeah. As a poet, John Montague said he was cut off. He even said that he was one of his employers, and he didn't like Ian Bailey, but he even noticed that Ian Bailey had been cut off from his roots in England, and he was a working class boy who got a scholarship, and he left the class system, and that he was over in Ireland on top of it all. But I mean, we have lots of English people in Ireland, and they get on very well with Irish people.
Yeah.
I think this idea that that Irish people don't like the British and we're all IRA, it's not, in reality, it's very rare to get someone he just dislikes the whole nationality based on the past.
Yeah.
But I think Ian Bailey he rubbed people up the wrong way for lots of different reasons, which are more to do with his individual personality, that and combined with being an English person or being an outsider.
Yeah, I've worked in Ireland, Cork City and Dunleary and so on, and everybody's just so friendly. I mean, that's one of the things. You're so funny. You've all got your green eyes, haven't you? It's very, very hilarious. Like some of our best stand-ups are Irish, like Aisling B and others. They're just so funny and so quick, and just so warm and friendly. It seems that Ian. Just rubbed them up the wrong way, and that was even really before all this kicked off. I think
we share a sense of humor with the British. I mean, at one point we were all one people, I think, and we are kind of essentially the same. It's just that, but I mean, we kind of have I couldn't understand too. We have this Monty Python sense of humor. I think, and I think sometimes. I mean, I lived in Italy, and the Italians have sarcasm, and the French have sarcasm. They understand it, but for the Irish people to pretend they didn't understand when Ian was being sarcastic. Yeah. And they didn't understand his black humour. I mean, it's not just an English thing; it's an Irish thing. It's a very Irish thing. Absolutely the same as the British. We have that. black humor and sarcasm.
Yes, I thought you did as well. Jim Sheridan made quite a lot out of that and said something like, people literally didn't understand him, but I think they were deliberately
I find
misunderstanding
it
him.
amazing that they didn't, unless
Mm.
unless they were extremely woke before woke was even a thing, because I know people who are
Mhm.
woke don't get sarcasm, they really don't. But I mean, maybe before woke was a thing, these people were kind of uber woke, and like 30
Unlikely, isn't
years.
it? I mean, yeah, this was 96, 97, wasn't it, when all this was
Yeah,
happening?
so, yeah, and the people behaved very naturally then. I mean, the sarcasm was definitely not. People wouldn't have been able to rub out sarcasm out of their. They wouldn't have been able to
No.
condition it out of their minds the way they can now. I genuinely think there are people who don't get sarcasm now because they've been so schooled to not offend anyone. That they can't.
Yes.
Yeah,
So that
they've always been AI schooled, like by AI to think like AI now. A lot of people have who are very
it
woke.
is a bit depressing, isn't it? So just to give people an example, if they're not as close to the case as we are, there's one comment in particular that comes to mind where Ian was giving a lift to a young lad, a local lad, and
Maliki, yeah.
Maliki, that's it. And he somehow came out with the phrase, "Oh, of course I killed Sophie. I hit her on the head with a rock," and all this kind of stuff. Which, yeah, I don't think anybody would have thought that was a literal statement, but it seems to have been interpreted that way by the mother, at
I
least.
can't understand, yeah, a drunk man, like a man who was like, he must have been, he would have been drunk or he would have been a very emotional man anyway. To say something like that, it sounds like, it absolutely sounds like
It
sarcasm,
sounds ridiculous. Yeah.
It doesn't sound like
You'd
anything
never.
but sarcasm.
Doesn't sound like a serious confession to a crime.
Yeah, and there was another case as well where he was drunk and emotional, and people were basically taunting him. And
Yes.
one woman played music, and it was, I think, probably would have been CDs in those days. She played it anyway, probably CDs on a sound system. But anyway, she started dancing and singing around to the music and shouting, Ian is a murderer," in time to the music. And he got emotional and he said, "Yeah, I'm a murderer." There was another case where he was crying in someone's arms and saying, "Everyone says I did it." I mean, these are things like.
Yeah.
Yeah, and he went to a neighbour's house and he also said, "Everyone says I did it." These are the things that a person who was very emotional, who was taking a lot of
Mm.
abuse from people, and
Oh, God. Yeah.
he really thought people genuinely believed he was a murderer. He knew they did, and it must be very upsetting for him. I can't imagine what it would be like for people to think you were a murderer. I mean, it must be very unsettling, and I don't know how I'd react, but I'd imagine that emotional outbursts would be very much part of it, and sarcasm and say, "Come on, look, you know how ridiculous this is." I'm not. Actually, he had no connection with the woman, even. Why? What motive? They haven't come up with
Yeah.
a motive yet.
Nobody's come up with any real genuine connection apart from this of sighting through a window or something ridiculous. So
Yeah, he
maybe
was
we
doing.
should start.
Yeah.
Yeah, gardening, and he just saw her maybe through the window. Maybe not even that. I mean, that's not going to generate enough emotion to do her in. So if we start at the beginning, so one thing that always interested me, because I came to this during lockdown, I think, when Jim's series came out, or maybe the year after that, and it wasn't known here really until the Audible series that Jennifer and Sam did. But what is it in Ireland about this? Why is it such a massive case? It's very famous, isn't it, in Ireland, and has been since the moment it happened.
Well, I think it's because of partly because of the victim. I mean, she was a beautiful French woman, and she was very famous in her own country. And she was, her husband was like a movie mogul, and I suppose it was that. And then it was the location, a remote location. It's like something out of a tourism ad,
Yes.
remote, very remote, windswept. It's kind of like, I mean, it's like Cornwall in Britain. It's that kind of place, It just lends itself to I'm thinking of Poldark. I'm thinking of Ian Bailey as
Yes.
Poldark along the cliffs. That's I could picture
The
him playing a part.
romantic.
He'd be as good as Aidan Turner as far as the image goes. So I think it's that that's part of it. And it was around the time as well when I think when Poldark was filmed. I mean, the original book was adapted around it. So it was that kind of. Yeah, it was not the late 90s. I mean, West Cork was a very romantic place at the time, and so it was similar to Cornwall. And then this glamorous French woman comes over, the impossibly glamorous French woman with an impossibly glamorous life, and she comes over here and she's leading a secret life. I mean, nobody knew. They only knew her they knew her by Sophie Bunio, which was her maiden name, but they didn't know she had this other life in Paris. All they knew was she was a mysterious French woman. I mean, it has all the ingredients of a thriller, and
Yes,
then Ian
very much
Bailey
so.
himself, so the whole thing. Then the fact that he was an Englishman, and the whole thing of not trusting the British and all this played into it. So as well as that, around that time there were a lot of missing women in Ireland, and so I think there was a lot of intrigue about. It was before we had CCTV, but only kind of scratchy old CCTV cameras outside banks and shops. But we didn't have smartphones. We didn't even have the internet at the time. So
well, famously, Ian wrote about that internet getting connected, didn't he, himself, from a newspaper?
Yeah, he was actually wrote an article about when the internet came to West Cork, and it was in a hotel, and everyone had to queue up to use this one computer. Yeah. So but he couldn't get a connection even for a fax machine. You couldn't even send a fax from where he was living, because it was so remote. He was in back of beyond. He was even. I mean, they had to go into the local town, which is called Skibbereen, which even the names sound really interesting to anyone who's not Irish. I mean, even I'm from Dublin, and I used to love saying the name Skibbereen. I used to love.
It's a lovely word.
Yeah, it is. It's just a funny word, isn't it? It's a romantic word, and it's funny as well.
It's a romantic place. It's cut off then, pretty much. Even the telephone system sounds a bit. Well, we know something about that from the recordings and the police and so on. It's very backwards, old-fashioned, cut off, remote, and people say it almost feels like an island, although it's a peninsula. It almost feels like you're on an island because it's so narrow.
It's a very narrow neck of land, to go into this, and you can come in and out to a narrow neck of land. And there's other things about it too. It was cut off culturally as well. I mean, it's kind of like I suppose like the New Forest in England in a way. The atmosphere, there's an awful lot of kind of pagans and druids and neo hippies, these new age travelers, they're there as well. And then there's kind of the wealthy people who go along, the artists and the people who would mix in the higher echelons of the arts in Paris and in America, in New York, for example, and not so much Hollywood, more New York, that kind of posh arts. That, and then well-off English people. I mean, Sir David Putnam has a house there. Jeremy Irons has a house there. These kind of people there. This is the kind of place that it is. So it had all the ingredients of a very interesting story. And I'm surprised that a major Hollywood movie hasn't been made about it, apart from documentaries. And I think it lends a big movie with like on the level of time when when John B. Keane, the playwright John B. Keane's play The Field was filmed, with Richard Harris. I think it lends itself to a big feature. Big old-fashioned blockbuster,
It's an obvious idea, isn't it? I can't believe they haven't, because like you say, it was a French producer, attractive lady, well-off, wealthy. It was at Christmas time, literally the day before Christmas Eve. It's had all the ingredients, and it was obviously a big shock and a big news story at the time. But it passed us all by. It just never, even though Ian was implicated quite early on, was never really reported here, not on the TV news, and nobody really knew about it.
It's just Ireland and France just reported it, but I mean, it intrigued people in Ireland and France for 3 decades, and for a while, West Cork was swamped with French journalists going over to write about it and to interview people, including Ian Bailey. But I think that it wasn't that it was. I don't think it was completely forgotten in Britain, because I read some of the articles around the time, but I don't know why the British didn't take to it as much as the Irish did, but I definitely think that on the one hand it has been well covered, on the other hand it hasn't been. It hasn't been covered in a straight, honest kind of way with no angle. I mean, everyone has an angle. Even I have an angle in my book. We all have angles on it.
Yeah, well, you mentioned your book, so I like that because you had that angle. I think there are a couple of journalists who have really tried to present both sides. There's one or two that I'm thinking of, but most of them seem to present an angle, and I like the fact that you did that, because your angle was completely different. Nearly everybody who's taken an angle in the past has said, well, it's Ian, it's obviously Ian, and we're going to look for all the bits that prove that or suggest it might be him, whereas you basically took a completely the opposite approach, which I'd come to the conclusion that Ian was innocent even during Murder at the Cottage, definitely on the Audible show. Netflix is obviously a bit of a one-sided thing, but I was surprised at when I tried to explain to people why I thought Ian was innocent. They wouldn't listen. They were like, oh no, I've seen the Netflix thing, there's no way that guy's innocent. And they get these very fixed ideas, but they don't seem to realize that from the almost day one, in fact, there were comments made at the murder scene about Ian. Almost day one, they just picked him as their suspect, and they set out to prove him guilty. and they still
I mean,
couldn't do it.
it's like they really believed it though. This is the thing about
Yeah,
the guards, the police. They really believed that he was guilty because he had been, he had beaten up his partner. But I mean, that doesn't. There are two things. That's a non sequitur: beating up the partner and then killing a
it's
random
irrelevant.
stranger.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
Mm.
but the thing is that he the locals, they also went on like a lot of police do. They obviously are going to talk to the locals. What do you think of being? So he was almost universally disliked in the community. So I can see why they would think it, but I don't know about the new. There's a new cold case review now. I don't know if they've sent off DNA from her body and from her clothes for analysis. So I don't know if they find. I don't know what they will do now if they find out that it has no connection to Ian. It might be that case. There's a case in England at the moment by, I can't remember his name now, Mr. Sullivan, and he was found not guilty of murder and rape
Yes,
of a
that was
girl.
just today or yesterday. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, well, it could be something like that. Only the only difference is Ian Bailey didn't spend all those years in prison, but he was probably worse than prison because he was in the community where everyone hated him, and then he died of a heart attack. So he really did lose about three decades of his life. He lost to to the presumption of guilt.
yeah. It's worth
But
reminding
all the
people that
time,
he was never even charged, was he? It wasn't that they had a case or anything. They never even thought there was enough evidence to charge him.
well, yeah, the guards wanted to charge him, but the director of public
Mm.
prosecution didn't because for lack of evidence. But then the French tried and convicted him in his absence in Paris, and they were relying on not just on their own kind. They came over here and did a bit of their own investigation as well, but they also had the Garda file. They did heavily rely on the Garda file.
Yeah,
And the problem with the Garda file is that that was built on a lot of hearsay in this country.
yes,
So I
yes.
actually think the French, they genuinely, like the Guards, they genuinely believed he did it. But everyone who believed he did it, I don't believe there was this malice against him. I don't believe anyone even had a reason for it because he didn't have anything that anyone wanted. It was just people really did believe that he was this bad guy.
Yeah, that's how I felt as
I
well.
don't
It's
believe
like
there's any
they
ulterior motive, I don't believe, some people are saying, I don't believe he was framed, for example. I don't believe there's
no,
an ulterior motive to pick Ian Bailey because he didn't
no.
seem to have any major enemies. It was just that he was the person that people thought must be the killer, that it was just
Yeah,
like a lot of people have been blamed, like that other guy in England, I suppose, and like Harry Gleeson, a man years ago, about 100 years, it was about 100 years ago, and he recently got a presidential pardon, for 80 years ago, I think. He got a pardon from the president of Ireland because he hadn't killed this woman. So it's just one of these things that happens, and it's generally a person on his own. It's generally a person with not enough family to support him. He didn't have children, for example. He didn't have any family in Ireland, so he was kind of on his own over here. Apart from Jules, who was his partner, and he'd beaten her up,
yeah,
so they weren't going to believe her, no matter how much. I actually think Jules is very persuasive as well because even when she absolutely didn't want anything more to do with him, she still said he must have been innocent. Even Jules' daughters didn't believe he had done it. So
yes,
they didn't.
yeah.
There was
That's
no love.
true, isn't it? Nobody who knew him well or lived with him, shall we say, in his circle thought it was him. He never confessed. No deathbed confession, which some people were hoping for. Just really nothing. So let's move on from Ian because we agree on that. So that's not going to be very interesting to people. But we don't agree on Alfie, do we? So let's if I just look at the notes a little bit. So maybe we should first of all sort of establish who Alfie is, and then we can get into some of the details. But essentially, I remember in Murder at the Cottage, they don't on camera interview Alfie's wife or partner Shirley, but they do interview him. And I think it was old footage. I don't think Jim Sheridan had it. It looked like it was old footage to me. It's quite grainy. But Alfie had
Yeah,
a bandage on his hand, didn't he? And
yeah,
he seemed to me just an old geezer who was just the neighbour. He didn't seem to have any emotion particularly about Sophie. He was just talking quite normally. He didn't look guilty to me. But you put everything together, and we agree. I think that he is literally the only person that we know of who was in the area for sure, 100%, because he lived there. But what
yeah.
was it that, or what do you can you remember when you started to think, oh, hang on a minute, it
Yeah,
could
well,
be him?
I initially thought this. Okay, I went down with the photographer, and we were looking at the houses, and we could see that there was one house that had been empty at the time. It was actually a holiday home owned by another couple, and then there was Alfie's house. It was right behind Sophie's house, and the photographer said to me, "Isn't it funny that her house is so near his, and yet she didn't run to the neighbour's house?" And I know people are saying there was obstacles. She would have had to go through a gate and all this. But I mean, even I'd climb over anything just rather than run into the wilderness. If you would climb over a gate, or you'd run up the hill, if you thought there was a murderer after you and you were somehow outside the house
For
and this
sure.
murderer was chasing you, and you'd scream, and at the very
Mm.
least, you'd call the neighbour if you heard somebody outside. But I mean, there's so many things about Alfie. It was what the bandage around his hand was one thing. They didn't really ask him about that. He said he was minding a dog. That was later disputed. The dog, he wasn't minding the dog that night. Then he was supposed to have been watching a movie and he hadn't heard anything outside. And but okay, that's
I heard that.
plausible as well. Yeah, if she was down the
Yeah.
end of the lane, I can understand that. But it was just stuff like Alfie went when he knew when his partner came back and said his body at the end of the lane. She was terrified. She left her car there and ran up the hill to the house. I mean, that was a natural thing. That's what Sophie would have done if she'd been terrified too. Anyway, Shirley reacted like Alfie would in that situation. She ran. She left the car. She wasn't going to turn around there and risk getting the murderer coming up. She ran up the hill on instinct and ran to the house. And Alfie, instead of ringing Sophie, I mean, he had a phone and she had a phone. He could have called her. He didn't. He just went out and he knocked on her door to try and warn her. He said, that gives him an alibi for leaving DNA on her door. Blood was found on her handle. The other thing is the only person I think plausibly who could have this new evidence that came out about him recently came out about the bushes being cut, the briars, and Sophie's body was removed and placed in the drive. Now, who would have had the time to do that except a person who lived there?
That's right.
And it's miles from anywhere. I mean, the other thing is they're saying a random neighbour who was known to be a bit of a nuisance. This man is dead, of course. He can't speak for himself, like Alfie, of course. But this musician, why would he wander up the hill to knock on Sophie's door more than Ian Bailey would? I mean, he just was another person that people didn't like, I think. So I think Alfie was the only one who had a motive to kill her. I mean, which was a neighbourly dispute. I mean, she had found out that he'd been entering her house when she was away, and he was taking baths in it. And he was. And also she'd had lots of rows over growing cannabis. And, he had a little grow house in the shed. He had quite an enterprise going with another man. So it could have been over that, and she had a row with him. But I think why did she go there at Christmas? She went there, I think, to confront him. She practically hinted at this when she was talking to somebody before she left. She had to go urgently to Ireland before Christmas. So she went and she wanted to have it out with him in person. And she probably marched down, confronted him at the gate when she saw him that morning. And she'd eaten her breakfast, so it was in the morning, it wasn't at night. So she'd eaten muesli. Nobody eats, like very few people eat muesli. I know I do sometimes. I remember saying that at the time when we were talking about it down in West Cork. And I said, actually, I do sometimes. But I don't think a sophisticated French woman would be eating muesli at night, especially after drinking wine and eating cheese, which is her habit.
Doesn't seem right.
Yeah, and after going to bed, after talking to her husband, while she was going to sleep, and she's a bit sleepy, so she suddenly gets up for a bowl of muesli, and then she goes out and locks herself out. I don't see that happening. And as well as that, if somebody knocked on her door late at night, I'd imagine the first thing she'd do would be to call the police. So I think she saw Alfie. She didn't see him as a threat. He's a man in his 60s, and he'd never been a threat to her before. She was familiar with him. She just knew him as a man she didn't like, I suppose. And it'd be different if Ian Bailey had turned up at your door. But if a man in his 60s who's a neighbour and comes to your door or happens to be down at the gate, you go down and talk to him and you wouldn't be afraid of him. So she went down to give him a piece of her mind. That's what I believe. He probably had something in his hand, like the way people farming often carry things around with them. He probably had a tool in his hand. Maybe he was fixing a gate. Maybe he had a wrench or a hammer. And he just hit her in a rage because he had a bit of a hangover on him, from cannabis or wine. Mm-hmm. And then he thought to himself, what had he done? He must have been absolutely distraught, and he finished her off. And then he may or may not have used the rock. I think the big breeze block just happened to be there. I think that's a bit of a red herring because, sorry for any mixed metaphors, but it probably is a red herring because it was there at the gate, to hold the gate open. Yes. I'd imagine.
Yes,
that's the only reason you'd have a breeze block down there. You wouldn't carry it down, even if you were a murderer. You wouldn't specifically carry a breeze block to hit somebody with. I mean, it's so bizarre.
Too big, yeah. So wow, we've covered a lot of.
But can you imagine even Ian Bailey saying, "Here, I know what I'm doing. I'm going to go to Alfie's shed, get a breeze block, and go down the lane to confront this woman." I can't see anyone doing that. It just doesn't make sense to logic.
Yeah, it doesn't add up, does it? So we've covered a few things there. So it was a long time before I really accepted that the murder probably happened in the morning. I think a lot of the documentaries heavily imply it was 1 or 2 in the morning or some nighttime thing. But the evidence of the breakfast is convinced me. So we're saying
I don't want to come up with that theory, by the way. That was a famous. She's a famous forensic scientist. You know, I'm trying
Yes,
to remember her name now.
Bridget. Yeah,
Bridget Shockley, or Shockley,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah,
But she's the one who came up with that. I think she worked with the West Midland Police, and now she works with the organisation set up in France to investigate this, to look into this. You know, that was set up by Sophie's family. So she actually came up with this
yeah,
theory that Sophie was killed in the morning, and it makes perfect sense. It also makes perfect sense because that if it was the morning, it would have been after 8 a.m. because I mean dawn in West
yeah.
Cork in the middle of winter is after 8, about I'd say 20 past 8. You know, so
So it would still been
describing
quite
the
dark, very dark,
yeah,
maybe.
yeah.
So we think the block's probably not involved. I came to that conclusion because I think there's something about the dressing gown. I can't remember if that was on the block or next to the block now, but
Well, the
it.
block was placed on the dressing gown. Yeah, maybe Alfie just rolled it over onto the dressing gown just to
mm,
keep it in place, so that Shirley would definitely follow. I mean, I think it's despicable what I believe Alfie did. He left it there for his poor girlfriend, his partner, to find, and I think
Now
he
that's
didn't he left
yes.
her in the briars, but he would have been under suspicion if he'd left her in the briars. He would have been. Whereas if he left her on the driveway, it looks like it could look like a passerby. You know, on the
Mm,
off chance that anyone would believe a passerby would go up to that place. I mean, it's so remote. When I drove there, I went there with a photographer who's a local. He's from Cork City, but he knows the area very well. He'd been there before, and he still got lost. And we had to ask directions
mm.
several times.
Wow.
And I was literally like switchback roads up and down the
Yeah.
mountain. You know, really, really
But
like
we know it was remote, but you're saying he'd been before and he still got lost.
yeah. But I mean, I'm just saying, Alfie was. I mean, it would be even more implausible that a stranger did it, or a randomer did it, even a local randomer, if he'd left her in the briars. So he moved her onto the track. So he had to have some, and then he
Mm,
had to find somebody local to blame. It would have to be a local. So he obviously set Ian Bailey up. He probably called him and said, Ian, do you want a big story? You're just the man to cover this.
yes, yes,
Here's your big break. Because Ian was kind of hankering after a career in journalism again. He
that's
missed
right.
his, obviously. He never stopped being a journalist, I think. And
Yeah.
he'd been working on a fish farm, then he'd be virtually unemployed, so he
Hmm.
living off the bills. So I mean, his pride would have been very, very injured. Just he would have felt like very he would have felt inadequate, I suppose, just living off this woman, living off his partner,
Well,
and
yes,
here's his chance to be famous again and to have some
yeah.
prestige.
So without going back to Ian Bailey too much, he was quite successful in England, wasn't he? He had a beautiful wife, a successful career. Everything seemed
Yeah,
to be going really well. She had a lot of money through her family, and then it all came crashing down. And that's when he left England. So
yeah.
he had a lot. He wanted to get back in the game and become a journalist again. So just look at my notes on Alfie. So you make a very compelling case, I have to say. And bearing in mind, Alfie's the only man within about 10 miles that we absolutely know was there, of course,
Yeah.
for sure.
I just think he's the only person who could have done it. Not because not because I mean he probably never killed anyone before in his life. He probably was a
No.
mild man, but he just snapped and lost his temper, and then he covered it up. And then what he did afterwards was it was bad enough to kill somebody, but then the way he got somebody scapegoated. I mean, I think the only one
Mm.
who actually scapegoated anyone was Alfie. Yeah, the only one who
Yes.
deliberately scapegoated Ian.
Yeah. 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 That's interesting. He would have had to do that, and particularly sinister as well. Sort of letting Shirley find the body and go through all that process and that fear and the shock of it as well. I mean, it was shocking to me. So on the Murder at the Cottage, it's all blurred out, but you can see that the stretched fabric and you can see the shape of a human, and it looks it's just appalling. It looks really sinister and spooky and creepy.
Yeah, it's
To actually have
absolutely
seen it.
Yeah, and
Mm,
her head was bashed in. I know it's horrible. I
yeah,
mean, it's like
yeah,
we've heard this so many times now. It was very shocking the first time I heard it. I heard a woman in Skull. The first thing I heard the name Skull, and I thought I'd never even heard of Skull. Even though I live in Ireland,
mm,
and the word Skull, and it was her skull that was bashed in. That's what stuck
yeah,
in my mind. To me, I thought this is like something out of a horror movie. And
yeah,
only it's real. And then I thought she's a mother, and she has a family, and she has parents, and brother and everything. She had two brothers, and she had a family, and to think of this poor woman to die so far from home and so brutally,
Well, and then
like
of
that.
course the police messed up the crime scene considerably as well. I mean, obviously techniques were a little bit less advanced then, but they just didn't do the basics, did they? And it was winter and cold.
Yeah, it wasn't. But I mean, there were a lot of mistakes made but they really thought they had their man when they saw Ian Bailey turning up. Anyway, I think they, that's. I think
Yeah.
I think there were mistakes though, but I don't agree with these people who are saying that there was a deliberate attempt to frame. And I mean the wild conspiracy theories, that some people have come out with, that it was a guard who's now dead. This kind of, he would have to be a handsome one, and he would have to be a womanizer. Of course, all the best it wouldn't work if he was just an ordinary guard, but he had to be a detective. A very handsome one and a womanizer. And then the other one was the French hitman theory. I don't believe there was any cover up, or there was any conspiracy. I certainly don't believe her husband set out to kill her. Even though I mean he was having an affair, but a lot of French men have affairs. I mean it's actually kind of more part of the the Sanko sets they have, like where they go out from 5 to 7.
Yeah.
Mistress, I know
it's a known thing.
I would hope that all French men don't think I'm blaming them or anything, but it's more accepted over in France than it is in Ireland or Britain. Yeah, so I'm sure she knew about it. I'm sure Sophie knew about her husband. He was quite a lot older than her, and she probably accepted that. She was,
I'm not sure they were that close. So there's rumours of them maybe splitting up, this, that, and the other. But it feels like she liked that time. Yeah,
he's evocative to her though. I mean, they spoke. They spoke. I think, but he'd become a friend. This thing, and they weren't planning to have a baby together. But she was speaking to him the night before she died, so she obviously did love him, but maybe she was kind of accepting that they were going to break up. And these kind of loose arrangements where you still love somebody but you've broken up with them. I mean, I can see that happening, but there's an awful lot of people who think in a very linear way, like, oh, he's having an affair. His girlfriend was soon after that got pregnant, and Sophie was over in Ireland. They just put it all together, and they can't see anything other than a big breakup, estrangement, and then they somehow put a hitman into all that. I don't know how they could jump.
Yeah,
that's what you do as you do when you're going to get divorced from somebody. You just hire a
hitman. Yeah, there's assumption there that maybe because a rich person can easily access a hitman somehow, but there's a lot of.
I'd imagine it'd be even more difficult for a rich person, a well-known rich person, because I mean, he'd be so well known. If you heard the hitman was blackmail,
yeah, asking in the pub.
Yeah,
does anybody know a hitman? It's ridiculous, isn't it? And I think that partly this information vacuum, the messed up DNA, the lack of witnesses, it was the middle of nowhere. It was not the middle of the night, but it was certainly dark. It was winter. It's a vacuum of information, isn't it? And you can see why people have jumped to conclusions. But you made a point there about the linear thinking and so on. And people, in a lot of true crime cases, they seem to get a bit simplistic about things. So you said, that it was, and it's, I agree with you. It doesn't feel like anybody's trying to set Ian or Alfie up. It's just they genuinely believed it was him. They thought they were doing the right thing, but because of that certainty, they didn't do the process properly, and they didn't interview lots of other people who might have known something. Or
I think it's more to do as well. Alfie. I mean, because Sophie was so glamorous in herself and her lifestyle. I think it was also the fact that on her background, even she grew up in this kind of lovely part of Paris and everything. They don't want to believe that she was killed by this boring old man. This kind of a man in his 60s. Alfie's just not sexy, that's why they don't want to believe it was Alfie.
It's not a good story, is it?
It's not. It's too boring, and it's not doing her justice. As I think, ironically, they probably feel, and they won't even admit this to themselves because they don't mean it. But I mean, it just in their heads, this doesn't do this glamorous woman justice.
Yes, exactly that. So we've got, it's pretty mundane, but we know Alfie has a strong motive. So even I do agree with you on the motive. So they've had this long-running dispute over land. I think when she bought the house, she thought she owned one of the sheds or the outbuildings, which turned out to be his. There's the cannabis growing. I was surprised that he had a bath in her house, but then people said, well, actually, he didn't have proper hot water running to his house back then. It was that run down. He couldn't have a bath in his own house without a lot of trouble.
I think the tank would be acting up sometimes, and they were all on, the plumbing wouldn't have been great. The houses, they're on hills, really remote from everywhere. There wouldn't have been mains water. It would have been from a well, so. And usually with a cluster of houses, there's one well to serve the cluster of houses, and there were only 3 houses there. One of them was vacant. So I'd imagine they had lots of problems with plumbing. And I'd say, everything was the heating, the toilets, everything. I mean, that would have been the thing. My dad was a plumber actually, so he'd know about this. I asked him about this years ago, and he said about the plumbing would have been just the thing there. They wouldn't have like that. You'd need to have somebody who was very good at. You'd need to have a plumber handy, because the old houses on a hill, remote from everyone. You know, there wouldn't have been a place where he could have relied on hot water, you know. So not
Yes.
like now. I mean, you know, it's just at the time. And as well as that, I think people were they were more relaxed about, you know. I actually think I was talking to another ex-colleague, and he has a holiday home, and he said once he woke up, when he stayed the night there with his wife, and he brought her down, she said never again we're selling that holiday home, because one of the neighbours had come in and had cooked them breakfast, and he was standing at the end of their bed. I mean, this would be
Oh my God,
my worst nightmare. And he said, that's normal in the country. You know, everyone walks into everyone's houses, and you know, he comes in and uses the shower sometimes, and he uses our kitchen, and you know, we'll use his. But this, like, you know, but like Sophie didn't get that. Obviously, I wouldn't get it either. I wouldn't like it either, and the photographer's wife that I was talking to didn't like it. But I'd imagine that Sophie was furious, but Alfie didn't see anything wrong with using her bath. You know, it was just. And he didn't see anything wrong with growing cannabis and on the land in a place where he'd lived long before she arrived, you know. So all he saw was this little woman coming down the hill to argue with him. He just lost, and he was probably had a massive head on him, you know, a hangover, and he just had to. He just lost his head basically and hit her, you know.
Yeah, you make a good case, and I've just been looking at the notes there. I think we've covered most of the points I'd thought of beforehand. But I suppose the big question, then you make a very logical case. It all hangs together. We know Alfie was there. He's the only person we know for sure, apart from Shirley, who was definitely in the area and completely undisputed. So why doesn't everybody else think it's Alfie? Why are you in such a small group? Why are they all still believing it? There's not many of them.
I think Alfie was very popular. You know, he was just a very affable person. And I mean, obviously, it probably was his first crime, but or apart from the cannabis crime,
we think it was.
Doesn't really count, you know. But I mean, it was his first violent crime. I'd say he was never violent before. I mean, I'd imagine a woman like Shirley wouldn't have stayed with him if she thought he had done it either, and she wouldn't have been with him. You know, she was, you know, a retired teacher, you know, retired art teacher. So I don't think anyone would believe he would do it. Nobody believed it, and no one could even fathom Alfie doing it. He was a successful businessman. He'd originally come from Dublin, and he had a few restaurants, or he had at least one major restaurant in the area. I think he had a few businesses in the area. He's always on hand to help out when there was a charity, you know, a charity fundraising drive. He'd always help out and give them sponsorship. He'd help the local football teams and that sort of thing, at the local boat race. So he was just a very popular, very friendly Mr. Community, you know, Mr. kind of. If they had a mayor of West Cork or a mayor of that peninsula, it would have been Alfie, you know.
The opposite of Ian in a way, you know. He's Mr. Popular.
Yeah, he was very good at networking, but it was a natural thing for him. You know, he wasn't charismatic, but he was just friendly and likable and approachable and unthreatening. Really, you know,
that's exactly how he comes across in that interview. Is just quite softly spoken, calm, friendly, all of those things. Like I never for a second, I don't even know when I first heard it might be Alfie. I don't know if it was you or somebody else, or if I just thought, look, he's the only guy here in the area, and I just can't believe it's him. He didn't seem frail, but he was old, and he was, you know,
I'd say he wasn't frail. I mean, he couldn't have been frail living out there. He would have been quite wiry, like an awful lot of men are, you know, quite strong. Even if he was, you know, even the kind of older ones, like 60 wouldn't be, in his 60s wouldn't have been old. Even now, even then it wouldn't have been old. But I mean, there's men in their 90s who are full of energy, and they look skinnier than Alfie, you know, out in the country, because you have to be kind of tough to live out in a remote place.
It's basically a farm, isn't it? It's a very hilly, a lot of sheds and outbuildings, and lots of work to do to keep that place going, I think.
Yeah, you'd be always chopping wood, or you'd be fixing a wall that's fallen down, or chasing an animal out. You know, you have to be handy with a shotgun as well. You know, in case not for people, but for you know, foxes and everything. So I'd say he would be quite resourceful, quite tough. You know.
Yeah.
Unlike Ian Bailey wasn't tough at all. Ian Bailey was one of these big soft men, you know, that he just looked big and tough, but I don't think he was. I think he was a big softie. Yeah,
he was tall, wasn't he? But he had it seems to me he struggled with that Christmas tree. You know, he had a bit of a job getting the top off that Christmas tree.
He had to get his partner, his daughter, to help him, you know, and I mean, the poor girl had to help him carry. But
so exactly.
But an awful lot of big people as well. You know, they're often not strong. You know, I often notice this. I mean, I've covered one of the strange things I covered when I was doing tabloid reporting was bodybuilder contests, and you know, this guy was telling me once, he was a photographer, but he knew them all, and he said these guys, he said they couldn't even lift a dumbbell half the time. You know, they're very weak. They're just full. They're all muscle bound. Ian Bailey wasn't muscle bound, but he was one of these just big soft guys. He played rugby for a while. Rugby strength is not the same as farmer strength.
Yeah.
Farmers are very skinny. Farmers are much. Another thing, this years ago, I knew a guy in the army. I used to date him, and he said something about the army cadets and the jockeys, the stable lads who used to work in all the racing yards, and the jockeys. But they were the stable lads were small. They were future jockeys. Like most of them were well under 5'8" or smaller, whereas the army cadets were big guys over 6 foot. And they used to always have a fight every weekend in Kildare town in the Midlands, which was near the army barracks. It was also near the racing yard, and the stable lads used to win every time because they were little wiry country guys.
Yes. Yeah, it's an interesting point, isn't it? Yeah, that they had the strength, maybe because they were a bit smaller and more compact and a bit less kind of gangly and awkward,
Jack Russell versus St. Bernard or something, it's like Jack Russell.
That's exactly it, isn't it? The big dogs are always calm and soft, and the little dogs are fierce. Yeah.
Yeah.
So what? I wonder where this goes next. So we know Jim Sheridan's making a film, a slightly interesting angle on it, where there's going to be a jury case, and maybe one of the jurors is sort of looks a bit like Sophie and somehow takes her point of view into the trial, which is a bit interesting. But he's got all that coming out. I think it's coming out this year. It's gone quiet for the moment. But where do you think this goes next? So this cold case thing, it's been open for years. It feels to me like it's never going to finish. But I don't know whether you know anything better than that, or from your sort of local knowledge.
I don't know. I hope it won't all fizzle out. I think they'll probably find that they haven't got any evidence that Ian Bailey's DNA is on it. It won't be enough for people to believe he's guilty. They'll say some reason that his DNA wasn't left. They'll say he used gloves or something like that. And he covered himself. He would have to cover he would have even had to worn a hazmat suit probably to not leave traces of himself.
So much blood.
Yeah, but even his clothes, even if he covered himself head to toe in a hazmat suit, there would have been fibers off the hazmat suit which would have touched him when he was putting it on. So I mean, there's no way that he could have that he couldn't have. There's this famous detective over here. He's He's retired now, Detective Pat Murray. He said every contact leaves a trace. So, if you think of that, even if you cover yourself head to toe in latex or something like that, you're going to be touching the latex when you're putting it on. Even if you wear gloves to put it on, you've touched the gloves, and then the gloves are touched. So if they don't find a trace of Ian Bailey, I think that'd be conclusive evidence that he didn't do it. Now, they won't be happy until they've. I don't think some people will ever be happy, even if they found Alfie's DNA all over it. They still say, "Oh, he must have tried to kill Alfie first." They'll have to do. They say, "Poor Alfie had to fight him off before any." In secret, tears.
So I found my approach to this changing a little bit. So I think when I first started looking at this, I just thought, oh yeah, there's a lot of evidence out there. So a lot of it's available to us for various reasons. There must be a solution hiding in this evidence somewhere. And I never got anywhere. There's people that we know who are investigating this really in almost like a forensic way who haven't got anywhere either. And it feels to me like now I'm quite interested in looking at little parts of it and exploring the possibilities, but letting maybe the readers sort of come to a conclusion if they want to in the comments and so on, which I think is a better way to do it because it brings other people in as well. What I don't like is setting myself up as some kind of messiah who can just look at some facts like Poirot and solve it. Because as soon as you try and do that,
I just decided to put an alternative view. But I absolutely be the first to admit I'm certainly not an expert, and I could be completely wrong about Alfie. And oh God, forgive me if I'm wrong about him. But I just think he's the only person that could have done it. He was
there.
Yeah, and but I mean, like if somebody comes forward and says some other person did it, and they can come up with a motive and everything, that'd be great. But yeah, I would like, I do think you're right to keep it open, and I think, and I always welcome people to criticise my book. I'm completely open to. I have been. I mean, I only thought about Alfie really when I started writing this book. It was like I was nearly finished the book when I decided, you know what, the Alfie thing was just niggling me, and I put it to one side because so many people had said Alfie couldn't have done it, and they were so sure of it. And I mean, I was really believing them because I thought, how could they all be so sure that Alfie didn't do it? It just he didn't seem like the sort, like what everyone's saying now. But the thing I and for a while I even thought Ian Bailey might have done it in just listening to people. But I think people need to keep an open mind above all. and that's
Yeah,
the main thing. Yeah, you
I
can't
think.
approach it with a closed mind.
Yeah, and it's made me look again at these documentaries. I mean, I think Jim Sheridan did a really good job, and I think he tried to show both sides. And the Audible one in particular was even longer and more detailed and more objective, probably. But at the end of the day, these are TV shows. They are sort of meant to be entertainment, aren't they? They're not necessarily, and the order they present things in, trying to build to a conclusion of the episode and a cliffhanger, it is entertainment in a way. And I don't think I appreciated until now how much they work it to make it entertaining and to make it dramatic. And I actually get more drawn into the boring old files and the witness statements, the really detailed stuff, because you feel like you're closer to the truth, the original source in a way. Because it's obviously I could come to Ireland and talk to people, but even now after 30 years, a lot of them have died, they've forgotten things, they've misremembered, they've heard, they've repeated things they saw on Netflix. The truth, I think, has very much faded or even disappeared in many cases.
Yeah, and the other thing is, even when I was down there, I wasn't even writing about that. I was down there for another reason once, and I stayed in a B&B. I was going to stay in this B&B, and I happened to mention Ian Bailey, and they immediately closed down. I actually said to the woman something about, the landlady. I said to her something about Ian Bailey. Oh, he was sort of a Heathcliff kind of character, wasn't he? And she blushed right first of all, and then her husband immediately clammed up, and suddenly I didn't feel very welcome, and I went and stayed I actually went down to the nearest town and stayed in a hotel instead, and I felt very, very unwelcome. I went into a few shops and I could see people kind of being very curt with me because I dared to say Ian Bailey was attractive, so this is, I mean, really, like, and I wasn't actually fishing for information. I just kind of said it. I was a bit tired, and I just started laughing, So I didn't think she would be the type who'd believe that he was the killer. I thought she'd say, yeah, he was, and that's why people have noticed
Well,
that
it's
or
so long
something.
ago as well. Well, everybody said at the time he was good looking. He was a very tall, striking man, very deep, striking voice. He's a very charismatic figure, wasn't he?
Yeah, but he knew it, you see, and this is the thing. That's in Ireland they have this thing called notions. I don't care about it. I think it's silly, but I mean, a lot of Irish people think if you're very good looking, you shouldn't own up to it, and you should play it down, and kind of self-confident. This was like back in the 90s anyway. I don't think this is bad now, but in the 90s it was kind of played down, and I mean, it was kind of beaten out of kids and everything. It was confidence was beaten out, and it was actually awful. It was repressive. But I mean, Ian Bailey came into that culture then, and Ireland was just beginning to open up, and it was it was kind of it hadn't got to the point yet where you could be confident. And I see the word notions is rearing itself up now, but people laugh about the word now. It really is people just laugh about that word now. I don't think anyone uses it without irony now. But the word "you have notions" it was actually a real insult, at the time when he came here.
So
And
that's a very
yeah,
particular.
the more handsome you were, though, the less likely, the less entitled you were to have notions. I mean, if it was an uglier guy, like you could get away with it maybe, but I mean, the late Prime Minister Charles Haughey, for
Interesting.
example, he wasn't a good-looking man, but he was very confident. People actually admired him, women fancied him and all, but he was allowed to be confident because he wasn't actually good-looking. It's weird. It's really
That is
messed up.
weird. It's an
Yeah,
Irish peculiarity or
it
custom
is. It's
or
very twisted now. Yeah, but
attitude.
it's just yeah.
Yeah, interesting, isn't it? I think men get away with it more, don't they? If they're funny and confident, they're seen as popular, perhaps.
Yeah, and I
Even if
suppose
they're.
Alfie was funny. Alfie was funny and confident, but mild mannered. If he was like
Mm,
he kind of ticked all the boxes for Mr. Popular, whereas Ian was this big
mm.
braggart. And he just rubbed everyone up the wrong way. Even women who fancied him like were avoiding him because they didn't want other women. You only fancy him because he's good looking, or
Yeah.
what were you doing talking about him? And even their men and women basically shunned him in the community. I think that was. The thing,
Yeah, I feel sad about it, and I think my theory quite recently was that he knew he didn't do it, so he had this kind of childlike naivety that if he didn't do it, then it didn't matter what he said about it. He could literally say anything because any court couldn't possibly find him guilty. But of course, he never went to court, and the society of the area did effectively find him guilty. He didn't seem to understand that if he was innocent, he sort of had to he should play a role of an innocent man and not talk about it all the time.
Yeah.
And he was obsessed by the case, wasn't he?
Yeah. But the thing is, I think it's one of these things where, yeah, what you're saying is absolutely spot on. I think, but you know, if you know you're innocent, you know, you're not going to be trying to look
Yeah.
innocent. You know,
Yeah.
you're
You don't
innocent.
need to.
You know,
Yeah.
why would you need to act innocent then? So he was just joking about people thinking he was guilty. You know, because and
Mm.
the other thing was he was an old-fashioned tabloid reporter. You know, he thought he had a scoop, and you know, he was a bit gung-ho about it. And I mean, I worked in the tabloids, and I know absolutely. I have to laugh at some of these. You know, some of them acting so po-faced about it now that it was shocking the way he was behaving, the way, you know, the stories he was writing and all, because he
Mm.
was, you know, this was normal at the time, you know, even well into the 2000s, you know, for you know, tabloid editors to be really gung-ho about a murder story and to kind of revel in the goriness of it, you know.
Same
And
here with
sexual
tabloids. Yeah.
intrigue, and so, you know, the stuff he made up about Sophie having lovers and all, she probably did, but I mean, he really went to town on that. He was really, she had a love nest. What was just a few meetings with people, fellas that came over to meet her. It became a love nest, you know, and
Mm.
you know, so she was having affairs and she was going to leave her husband and all. But this was typical tabloid stuff at the time.
Yeah, it was the same here. There's a lot of made up stuff. We've got all the phone hacking stuff now, and they were always
Yeah.
either trying to catch people out or make more of little things than was really the case. And that happened here. And
Yeah.
I don't think an objective person would criticize him for jazzing up the case and making the stories sound really exciting because
Yeah,
they wanted to sell
especially
newspapers.
yeah, especially when his career hadn't been going so well, you know, and this is big.
Mm.
This is his chance now to make a career for himself again, to get back into journalism. So yeah, and
Even
he
that
like,
aspect, you know, the fact that he was a journalist or a one to meet, and literally was on the doorstep. He was the first person that Eddie Cassidy called that day.
yeah,
You
he
know, you
must have
could have,
felt he won the jackpot, you know, and then suddenly it
yeah,
all went sour. Yeah,
for about a week, he was like the hero who was going to make his fortune, and then he gradually got the feeling that they were actually looking at him as the suspect. That must have been bizarre. If you know you're innocent, and that it's just crazy.
yeah. I mean, as his solicitor said, Frank Buttimer said, it was a Kafkaesque nightmare for him. It really,
Mm.
it's your worst nightmare to be accused of something, a crime you didn't, a really horrible crime that you didn't commit, and then to have people really believing that you did it, and all the while he was just doing what he, you know, he must, from the elation of getting a great scoop
Yes,
to suddenly
yes.
finding out that he was being blamed for it.
It's such a reversal, isn't it? And
Yeah.
I mean, I always think something I've thought of. I mean, it's always possible, but I mean, how many cases are you aware of where the journalist or the main journalist turned out to be the killer? I mean, that's like an Agatha Christie plot, isn't it? I can't think of a
Yeah.
single example.
No, I don't. I think that probably the journalist will be the least likely to be a killer. You know.
Yeah,
You know.
it's ridiculous. There's so much about it that's ridiculous, but people do have these very strong views just based on a couple of documentaries and a few newspaper articles. But
Yeah.
so that's about an hour now, but I don't know how long you've got, but we've covered the main stuff. I'm going to think about Alfie again. I mean, let's face it, he's the only person in the area, so I mean, it
Mm.
could be him. You know, it could have been this random person, but we've said already how remote it was. It was really, really remote. It's hard to convey just how remote that area is,
Yeah,
isn't it?
I wish I could convey it. I mean, even now
Mm.
it's still remote. But I saw it in 2011, and actually the French team came over. A group of French investigators came over, and they tried to walk the route, and they kept getting lost. And I mean, and they were, you know,
Mm.
they're walking across the rough ground. They were trying to walk the route Ian Bailey walked. And actually, I spoke to Sophie's uncle, Jean-Pierre Gazot, and he said that he tried to walk it, and he said he did it in 32 minutes. I think he said half an hour anyway. And he said if I could do it, that Ian Bailey could do it in much shorter because he's a fit man. But I mean, you know, it doesn't work like that on a cold, icy night. And you know, he
In the
would.
dark.
On top of that, Ian Bailey, I asked him, was he drunk? He wasn't. But Ian Bailey was drunk. You know, I wasn't. You know, I was meaning that, like, do you ever try it while you're drunk? Because Ian Bailey was
Yeah.
absolutely. He was so drunk that
Mm.
a guard came forward to say that he was going to try and ambush him on the way home to catch him for drunk driving because
That's
you
right.
know,
Yes.
so he
Mm.
was extremely drunk, you know, and he'd gone back, and he had Alfie had a deadline. He'd had this article that he was struggling with. Now people are saying he wasn't a proper journalist if he was struggling to write an article. Well, you know, I think if he was on the spectrum and he found this article boring, you know, even like I'd find
Mm.
it hard to write something I find boring. But I mean, if somebody
Yes.
was severely autistic, which I think he may have been, you know, a high functioning but
Mm.
severely autistic man, he would have found it so hard to write this article because it was so boring and it's about a subject that he found difficult to grasp. I mean, he didn't know a thing about the internet. I mean, you know the way you get the person in their 80s and they don't know how to use a smartphone. Well, he was like that, you know, at the time because he'd never he you know, he was still using shorthand. You know, which I learned how to use shorthand too. He was still using shorthand and notebooks, and suddenly he had to write an article about computers, as he called it naively.
Yes.
You know, just. I don't think he even would have known the word internet. I don't think he even hardly used that word at the time. So he was struggling with this really boring and really difficult task. And for him to get up then and walk across the moors, you know, like, you know, walk across the mountain, it was basically a mountain with all rough countryside, or else go around the long way around the road, or else drive around, and the roads were icy as well. So I can't see it, you know. He would have gone into a ditch if he tried to drive it, and he would have fallen, you know, to his death maybe. He would have fallen into a rat hole or a foxhole if he tried to walk it as well, you know. I mean, I nearly broke my ankle a few times. You know, and I'm very careful, you know. And I was walking across the scrubland, and you know, your foot goes into a rabbit hole, and
it's uneven.
You know, yeah, you slide, you go into briars. So it's so. The other thing about the briars as well. I mean, the Christmas tree would leave scratches. I mean, anyone who's ever tried to cut down conifers, I have a few times, and you know, like they do kind of leave you with little marks, you know, little kind of. Like they could look like briar marks, I suppose. You know, I don't know, but I mean, I'd imagine they would. But I often got the sap. The sap stings your skin, and it leaves kind of welts in your hands. You know.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. And then there's comical drawings they did of his hands. There's no photographs of these scratches, and there's a rough outline of a hand with like 3 lines across it or something. It's almost like it's just ridiculous, almost. You know.
The other thing is that some people saw these scratches on his hands before Sophie was killed as well. You know, and there was also the evidence that Jules, his daughter, was helping him to bring it to cut down a Christmas tree and then drag it down to her grandfather's house. So, and they had one for the house and one for the grandfather. So, you know, you would be bound to, even if there were no briars around. I mean, the sharp edges of the wood of a coniferous tree, of any tree, is very sharp, and you'd have splinters and. You know, it doesn't have to be briars. You know, anything sharp or anything would do that. I mean, I don't know how they got the idea that fir trees or pine trees wouldn't leave those marks, because I honestly thinking of the light, soft leaves. But I mean, if you're cutting it down, you're going to have loads of sharp bits of wood sticking into your arms and your hands.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, we can sort of pick apart just about any part of that evidence, and it's such a shame that they didn't really honestly try to find evidence against anybody else, even Alfie or anybody. It's all about Ian, and it all seems very thin, even after all this time. So I don't know how we wrap this up. I think I suppose one final question might be, you know, what do you think should happen next? What do you think will happen next? Do you think we'll ever? I don't think we're ever going to get there now. Not really.
Well, I hope. I know. I'd like to hope so, but I think the best thing they have done is send away the clothes for Sophie's dressing, you know, pajamas. It's horrible. Her leggings and her dressing gown. It's very sad thinking of it, but they sent them away. They're sending them away for testing with the FBI, so it's going to be completely independent. So no one can say then that they didn't do it properly. You know, I mean, I have no doubt that it would be done properly in Ireland or Britain or anywhere, or France.
Yeah.
But I think they are right to send it away to America, so it's completely removed from everything to do with the murder and everyone involved. So, you know, if they get it, I'm just hoping that they will. I think DNA is the only hope really now of solving this.
Yeah.
It
seems that way.
Who won't want to believe Alfie did it, though? That's the only thing. But I do think the DNA will be what will solve it.
If they do find DNA, that would be an absolute bombshell, wouldn't it? But it's kind of sad in a way, isn't it, that to think that her clothes, bloodstained clothes, are still available. They're still in storage, you know, after all this time. Yeah. It's quite a sad situation, really.
It was very sad too. Ian Bailey, he couldn't even have a proper funeral. I mean, his sister couldn't have a funeral for him, you know, and his ashes had to be sent over to her. She had some sort of I believe she had a memorial recently, you know, in West Cork. There were certainly plans for one. It was only going to be her and a few very close friends of his and his solicitor, you know. But it's just very sad that I think people who said it was Ian Bailey were so sure of it. The other thing is people don't like to admit when they've made a mistake. I think everyone should be willing to admit when they've made a mistake. But it's going to be very hard for all these people. Some of them experts, and some of them journalists, some of them experts, some of them local people who thought they were good at judging character, to have to admit that it was their friend Alfie and it wasn't this other man who was persecuted really and died. Well, they believed that he was this monster, so it wasn't like they persecuted an innocent man in their minds. But to actually find out that you had blamed the wrong person all these years, and that the real person was someone you actually liked. I mean, I don't know. I don't think some people will be incapable of accepting that, I think.
I can't even. If I wake up tomorrow and read an article saying that they've found the killer and they know who it is, I'd be stunned. And I can't even imagine the impact that would have in West Cork. It would be enormous.
Just think of someone you love or someone you even like, and you find out they've done something monstrous, and that someone you absolutely can't stand didn't do it. I mean, just imagine what it would feel.
Well, that in some ways would be the perfect ending to this case. It's such a crazy, wild, improbable case anyway. If you take all the different bits, for it to end 30 years later with some kind of mild-mannered neighbour being the killer with proper evidence against him with DNA, but at least that would be a nice Hollywood finish, wouldn't it?
Yeah, it wouldn't be the most glamorous ending, but I mean, I think it would be the most. Yeah, I know it doesn't. The way the deathbed confessions and all this of the dead detective was supposed to have confessed on his deathbed, and the other guy and the musician and all this. These things happen in Hollywood movies. That's more Hollywood. But if you want to get away from it, if AI wrote a movie about this, it would have deathbed confessions, because AI works on cliches. It trawls the net for all the cliches. But if a human being wrote a really good thriller about this, and based it on fact, it wouldn't be the deathbed confession. It would be the mild-mannered neighbour, and it would be more interesting, I suppose. But it wouldn't be. It just would be still very unpalatable to people in you, Alfie.
Yeah. Cool. Oh, that was really nice talking to you. I'm going to stop the recording in a second, and then we can wrap up. But yeah, have you got anything else you'd like to add or reflect on?
I just want to say, I'm delighted that you took this up, because you obviously, you've the Crime Guy blog is really fascinating, and you've taken up a few of these stories, and I think it's great that you're in England and you took it up, because not enough people in England really followed it, and Ian Bailey is from England, and he was kind of forgotten about, I think. So I do think it's great that that also that you're looking at it with an open mind, unlike an awful lot of people who can't seem to see beyond Ian Bailey as the killer.
No,
I've
enjoyed it.
You're actually more objective than I am, which is great too, because I started off objective. For a while I was steered towards Ian Bailey as the killer. It's very hard not to get steered towards this one. Everyone you love, you like and respect, works in newspapers. These people that I kind of looked up to all believed it was him. So it was very hard for me not to get swayed over towards thinking it was him. And for a while I was wary of him. I remember being relieved when he couldn't meet me, even, this sort of thing. Because I mean, people were saying to me, "Aren't you lucky you didn't meet him?" A lot of women find it very intimidating, What it reminds me of? I know this is awful. It sounds very irreverent. But Father Ted. The bit where the episode with the sheep, where they're trying to frighten a sheep. I don't know if you know this one. Where there's a sheep contest, and it's basically like a kind of beauty contest for sheep, and the rival sheep owners are trying to frighten the sheep, and they're going to whoa. Well, this is what they were like with Ian Bailey. Like, he's a bogeyman. Like, They were more or less saying that. They were all saying he's so creepy. Women are terrified of him. When you get the chill talking to him and all this. And I said, well, I spoke to him on the phone. I didn't get the chill. And then, he couldn't meet me. His solicitor grabbed the phone off him and just completely nixed the meeting. But I remember people were saying to me, "Aren't you glad you didn't have to meet him? He's so dangerous, and he intimidated other women, other female journalists." So for a while I was swayed, and then when I finally came around to Alfie, I am biased now against Alfie, but I mean I can't. It's not the kind of bias that comes from prejudice, if you know what I mean, because it's kind of bias that comes from having worked it out, as far as I understand it. But I still think it's great that you're objective, because I'm not anymore. I just think it's Alfie.
I think it's easier with that distance. I mean, I think I just found Murder at the Cottage so compelling, and the whole case, with Sophie, with her background and fame and fortune, it's an amazing story. Yeah. And then, of course, a few weeks into this, Jim called me one Friday, and that really gave me a bit of confidence and a bit more interest in it. And I thought, wow, there's somebody here who's really looked at this. And he was kind of looking at the fact that I would almost say I'd set my mind that Ian hadn't done it, almost trying to be objective, but just not being able to find any evidence that Ian had done it. And I think that's what Jim latched onto, was here's somebody else who's trying to find the truth here.
And the other thing about Jim Sheridan as well, I know he said that Now, this is an interview I read about him. He said that Ian Bailey wasn't very easy to do, but you'd get very tired after talking to him or something. He said he'd be kind of wanting to get away from him. Well, I noticed this. I was talking to him online, during the pandemic, shortly afterward. We were still kind of on Zoom, and Ian Bailey had taken to TikTok and all this stuff like a teenager. He was delighted with himself. But you would get fed up with him, after a few minutes, because he would he'd kind of drain you sometimes. He was a draining person to be around. So I can see why. So Jim Sheridan was a bit sick of him, I think, at the end. But even he knew he couldn't have done it. Jules Thomas was absolutely fed up with him. She didn't want. She said she didn't even think about him. When she heard he died. So that's and yet she still believes that he was innocent. So people who don't like him. This is the most compelling thing. People who actually don't like, who didn't like Ian Bailey either right through it or at the end, still believe he was innocent.
Yeah, I think that is a nice place to end, isn't it? Is that people who really didn't like him still wouldn't say that he did it. They still thought he was innocent. So yeah, let's see what the future brings, and it's been really nice talking to you. I'll stop the recording and then we'll wrap up. Hopefully it will stop. There we go. Stop.